Hei, kjære lytter, og tusen takk for at du lytter til Henrik Beckheim podcast. Du kan nå bli medlem av denne podcasten, og fremover nå så vil alle de som er medlemmer få tilgang til de nyeste episodene først. Det koster 49 kroner måneden, samme som en kaffe omtrent, og du bidrar da også til å støtte arbeidet med denne podcasten. Så trykk på lenken under her i beskrivelsen, og bli medlem i dag. Jeg setter stor pris på det. Tusen takk. Wow. Samuel, thank you so much for coming to my studio, man.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to be here.
And thank you so much for last night. It was a wonderful event where we went down with Koos and Karls and swam around in the Norwegian fjords and in the sauna. What did you think of last night?
It was certainly genuinely one of the most unique experiences I've had in my life. I mean, to be in a sauna, looking out into the icy cold waters of Oslo, and then stepping out of the sauna into quite literally standing in minus 14 degrees snow was certainly not something. If you told me 6 weeks ago that would be an experience I'd be having, I possibly would have laughed. But it was, I mean, I actually felt totally rejuvenated. When I got home from that sauna, when I got back to the hotel last night, I felt like totally like a new person. Yeah.
Well, that's great to hear. That's because this is your first time in Norway as well, right?
Yeah. My first time in Norway.
Yeah.
It's been great.
Yeah.
It's great place.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about both positives and negatives today, because let's start with, you told me a little experience that you had when you arrived here. You went to visit some people, then you went to a bar and met some Norwegian girls. And let's talk about what happened there.
Yeah, I just sat down at the bar. And within a couple minutes, there was some people that came and sat next to me. So I got speaking to them, and it was three Norwegian girls around about my age, maybe slightly younger, late 20s. And they asked me where I was from. A little bit into the conversation, I told them from Tel Aviv. Two of them seemed actually quite excited about that. They thought it was very cool, and one of them has said they always wanted to go there. The third one immediately, just off the cuff, said to me, well, this conversation can only continue if you're against the genocide. Which I think, it took me back, you know. I mean, like, here's the thing, I deal with that on a professional level all the time. But living in Israel, you're shielded from having to deal with that on a social level, certainly not sitting at a bar. All right, I was just there to kind of enjoy myself on my first night in Oslo, and I wasn't kind of expecting to run into that. But the other experience I had was totally different. In fact, it was last night on the way to the saunas, which was with a taxi driver, and he also asked me where I was from during that conversation. I told him, and he told me he was a devout Muslim from Somalia, and he's been living in Norway for 20-odd years. And he told me, you know, how much he prays for peace and that he has love for the Jews and love for Israel and everything like that. So these are two just totally contradictory circumstances to have in a matter of 2 nights, both which I think speak to probably a lot of what's going on in society at the current moment.
Yeah, it's a good example of it. It's so polarized, like the outer extremes of both, right?
Completely.
Why do you think that is? Why is this topic so polarized? Why are we lacking the middle ground where nuances and complexity can flourish? Why are people tending towards the outer extremes of this?
Well, I think maybe that's a sign of the society at large. We do tend to see that being a trajectory, the general fabric of politics in many different countries, in Europe, America, even in Israel in some capacity. So I think in part it's got to do with that. The other thing is, I don't think a lot of people approach the conversation of the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians in good faith. I don't think anyone's really coming to the table with a genuine desire to be curious or knowledgeable or to have any sort of desire and influence. It's very ideological. And it's also this conflict is very symbolic. So the Americans look at the conflict and they see racism. The Europeans and the British look at the conflict and they see colonialism. And once again, the Jews have become the symbol for which other societies in the world can almost redeem themselves of their sins. That's how I view it. Israel has become essentially the moral whip of American and European society, of the Greater West. I could liken this actually, because I think it's actually much deeper rooted in people than we maybe discuss. Anti-Semitism in the West can no doubt be traced back to the origins of the Christian doctrine. Anti-Semitism that we understand of it today. There's a concept in Christianity called the original sin, that each human being is born with a proclivity to sin, and that in order to redeem yourself of that sin, you must subscribe to the doctrine of Christ, and that's the way to bring the great universal salvation of the world. That resembles in many, many deep ways kind of a parallel framework with progressive politics. They might not believe in original sin, but they believe in inherent privilege, that by the fact that you are born, let's say, a straight, white, male, and European, you are born with the sin of inherent privilege, and you absolutely are obligated to subscribe to certain ideologies, and through the movements and through the different institutions in which you work, subscribe to certain doctrines, and that's the only way in which you can redeem yourselves of the supposed sins that you've inherited at birth by fact of your identity. And I think the Jews in the ancient times fell victim to the Catholic Church and the concept of the original sin. That's another part of anti-Semitism, overlooked. It's often focused on the concept of Judas and Jesus, and that the Jews supposedly killed the Son of God. But there was also this concept of the original sin, where the Christians looked at the Jews and said, well, if you don't believe in the concept of the original sin and you're not prepared to follow Christ, well, then you're inherently a moral failure, and you are the obstacle to this universal salvation. That is pretty much what I think is unfolding with regards to progressives and the concept of human rights. They have deemed Israel to be the ultimate obstacle to this universal utopia that they seem to think can exist, will exist, or does exist. But symbolically, they've latched it onto the Jews because there tends to be a proclivity to believe that the Jews are part of some evil conspiracy.
And how much of that do you think is actually...
I don't think most of it's conscious.
No, exactly.
Yeah.
How much of that is unconscious anti-Semitism? That they're falling into these anti-Semitic traps almost, that they don't even...
Yeah,
they're not even aware of.
I don't think much of it. I don't think much of it's conscious, which is why I'm less inclined always to give that as my final answer as to what the problem is.
Yes.
But I think it's a core component to understanding the social societal framework of it.
Because don't you think that also anti-Semitism can be unconscious?
Yeah,
we
sure.
we can talk about both conscious and unconscious anti-Semitism. I think perhaps most of it is unconscious. It's just. What would you say, like matrix or a pattern that people follow deeply that they don't even know? So to give people the benefit of the doubt, which I like to do, is that sometimes I try to point out to them, to the critics and to the people who are displaying the most outrageous anti-Semitic tropes. I tell them that, hey, you're falling into a mental trap, a trap of... a mind virus, almost, like that's a buzzword that's thrown around now.
Sure.
But I think it is a mind virus because it takes you, it kind of grips you and the way that people are thinking without even knowing about it.
Yeah, I mean, it's like living in the Truman Show.
Yeah.
And, it's a total... when people come out of realizing that they've been living in the Truman Show of anti-Semitism, they feel like they've just escaped like a mental asylum.
Yeah.
Look, the one thing I could possibly add to this is what's very important to understand about, I want to say, the anti-Semitism of the Palestinian cause, is that it does not just rely on the concept of no Jewish state existing in any part of the land between the river and the sea, regardless of what the borders may be. It's the core motivating and mobilizing factor behind what drives support for the movement. Sudan. There's been a war going on in Sudan from September 2023. It's more deadly, and there has been more displacements. double the amount, triple the amount. Russia, Ukraine, same story. But unfortunately for the Sudanese and the Russians and the Ukrainians, they do not possess the unique ability to say that their enemy thrives off the killing children for sport.
Yeah.
And that this enemy is part of a global conspiracy responsible both for worldwide suppression and local suppression. That's why you see in America, there's this now, through the Palestinian movement, there's been this total, absolute obsession with a group like AIPAC. Now, whether I agree with AIPAC or not on certain things is totally irrelevant from the fact that AIPAC is nowhere near the largest lobby group or the largest funder of lobbying. And yet, the way in which it's treated is as if all the other lobby groups are spending this and AIPAC is spending what's at the ceiling.
Yeah.
It's actually totally the opposite. I'm not even sure, I don't know the total thing, but I'm not even sure if they're in the top 50 or something like that. So that all plays a part into it. That's a very core component of what drives people. Again, some of it may not be conscious. Some of it may not be conscious among the people that follow it.
Yeah.
It's certainly conscious and certainly calculated by the people that have planned this. And there was, if you look immediately after October 7th, there was an entire industry of lies, apologia, and obfuscation ready and waiting for the moment. And they came with all the most arbitrary phrases that really meant nothing. Oh, well, context matters. Okay, but what context matters was used in that moment was not for genuine understanding. It was used to obfuscate what happened on that day, and in other cases, to totally erase what had actually happened on that day.
Do we know who made that package, who funded it? I've heard like suggestions like Qatar and different countries who have a tendency to fund terrorism. Do we know who was behind this kind of marketing package almost?
Yeah, I'm not sure that it was a specific series of one movement or one country. I think Qatar has certainly been involved over the decades. But here's the success of this campaign actually, because for years, Qatar and the regime in Tehran and the BDS and the Free Palestine movement and various different Islamist organizations like Muslim Brotherhood affiliated organizations throughout the West have been able to operate with total free reign for decades on this. Today, you didn't even need to have a planned thing. That's why I called it an industry. It operates on itself today. It's been so successful. You know, there was a report released by the Institute for Extremism at the George Washington University at the end of October 2023, which released wiretaps from the FBI of a Hamas meeting in the early 2000s that happened in America, in Philadelphia, at a hotel. Hamasniks set up an American Hamas network, which they changed the name to the Palestine Solidarity Network. They speak about, we're not going to call this the Muslim schools the Al-Aqsa education. We're going to call it, Palestinian Rights School. Some of these people were later found guilty of funding Hamas's terror activities in Gaza and deported from America. And yet those deported from America, Abu Marzouk, who goes on to become an advisor for Ismail Haniyeh, was still provided the opportunity to write for the New York Times. What do you expect? So they had this plan, and their whole thing was to disguise. They spoke about disguising their Islamist ideology under the concept of freedom, tolerance, and democracy. And that is the way in which they'll win the hearts and minds of the broader public. And they spoke about the deceit and disguise. In fact, they even quoted the Quran in the passage that speaks about you can deceive your enemy. This is all FBI wiretaps, was released publicly in court documentation, and it's worth actually looking at. But they've been so successful that there's no longer a need to be as organized or to deceive and act within deceit. You could be totally open about it today. You could walk around the streets of New York or the greatest campuses of the world with a Hamas flag, and you could totally support that organization. And you will have the professors who will come in, who will apologize for the students who are supporting that, and give you a whole bunch of what I call secular liberal delusions as to why jihadists do what they do. I say this as a secular liberal, but the majority of secular liberals in the West are totally deluded to jihadist motivations and to the religious convictions that actually drive their actions.
It's so surreal, because one thing is that young students are like convinced of this and manipulated by this whole PR program that Hamas and these organizations have. But another thing is that it's like almost accepted in society to walk around cheering for Hamas. Like, those are two combining things, but they're also two separate things. What do you think has made our society have such a little immune system, you might say, for these kinds of things happening? Like, we're just bending over backwards and accepting this in our society. What happens? Why is that?
Yeah, I think this actually speaks to the biggest problem, which anti-Semitism fits into this. But I always say, anti-Semitism is a sign of a society in the midst of a crisis. And if you really want to defeat anti-Semitism, you have to target that crisis, and you have to go after the ideologies and the political parties and the political affiliations that are instilling that crisis and that are working on that. That's how you defeat anti-Semitism. Education can only get one so far. So this speaks to the broader problem. If you look at this alliance, let's say an alliance between progressive movements and Islamist movements, that's kind of what we're referring to over here. They have one underlying substrata. I have no doubt that there's a predatory tactic of Islamists to deceive the kind of, progressive movements into garnering their support. Unfortunately, there's also an alignment of principles. And the alignment of principles in progressivism today is there's kind of this postmodernist anti-Western agenda. And Islamism is one of the core components of Islamism, is anti-Westernism. And one of the core components of progressivism today is anti-Westernism. There's just a total mutual understanding of a worldview between these two people who would otherwise be totally contradictory to each other's beliefs. But yet that kind of principle of the anti-Western agenda, it trumps their total differences in the way in which they view rights for homosexuals and women and people who the Islamists would also consider infidels, for example, right? It is ludicrous, it is delusional, but it exists. And that is really a pivotal point to make to the non-Jewish world, because this is their crisis as well, right? This is their crisis. And there's just no example in where things like that work out well for any society. I mean, I really can't think of an example of where anti-Semitism has risen among the coattails of some sort of distorted, confused ideology and identity crisis that's really turned out well for any country. There's just no example of that. So, even if Norwegians or British people or the French are going to save themselves to save themselves, well, fine, then just do it. And then the Jews will be collateral benefits of you saving yourselves. I'm not really interested, but ultimately, Europe is, in my opinion, is heading down just a very self-destructive path here. There tends to be a willingness to totally abandon the principles that kind of make Europe in the 21st century.
And why is that? Why are we willing to abandon our own principle? My theory, just to throw it out there, is that we have in the Western world, we have a humbleness culture, right? So we value people who are humble, who are able to say, I'm sorry, who are able to be introspective and see where I made my own mistakes. I carry my own responsibilities. And a kind of perverted version of that is being against your own values, like a perverted, distorted version of being able to take on your own. Yeah, self-deprecating. and then it has gone too far, like that kind of value, but without any borders. So that is like the most extreme way you can display that is being against your own values, being against your own society, being against your own Western ideals, right? So perhaps, do you think there's something in that? Do you say
I think there's something certainly in that. But I think it extends outwards from that to, look, there was a reckoning that happened, okay, in Europe and America, in the West, in the general West, where it started to look at itself and acknowledge the racism of the past and its colonial endeavors, and seeing all these kind of, truly, truly horrific things that Western countries have done. And that's why I think there's a dark irony to me, a Jew whose family escaped Europe, coming back and telling Europeans, I think it's maybe a good idea to hold on to the principles of the Enlightenment. There's some sort of dark irony to that. But
Indeed.
But what I will say is that through that process, became very much this self-deprecation of, we are the worst thing that possibly could have happened ever to humanity, while totally refusing to see that the Muslim world, for example, had a 1,300-year empire, killed roughly 270 million people in the process, and had a larger slave trade than the Atlantic slave trade, right? Now, you just can't say that today without, possibly being accused of Islamophobia of some sort of nature. So it's totally possible, to look at Western society and see the sins of the past, and also acknowledge that the principles of the Enlightenment are, which birth human rights and birth freedom and birth liberty and the free press and liberal democracy and all these kind of things come out of that period. And recognize that's possibly the best thing that we have to offer today in the world, and that's worth defending. That doesn't negate the crimes of the past. And actually, a lot of the crimes of the past in Europe were not carried out in the name of the Enlightenment principles, right? Certainly, Nazism was certainly not born out of the Enlightenment in the fact that, yes, it came around in that period in the 19th, 20th century, but it was actually proposing a total alternative worldview to the principles of Enlightenment. Same with communism and Marxism, a total alternative to the principles of the Enlightenment. Those two regimes, fascism and Nazism in particular, which was not just fascism, it was imperial and expansionist, and communism like the Soviet Union, those are the two criminal ideologies of the 20th century, not the Enlightenment principles. So there seems to be this total delusion about that the Enlightenment principles need to be chucked in the bin because they're a sign of Western supremacy. Now, when you do that, you actually make your society susceptible to the predatory tactics of Islamists who also hate your society and who want to essentially weaponize that from the inside out.
Why do you think the Islamists hate Western society so much? What is that hate about? I've always wondered that.
Yeah. Well, I suppose for this we maybe need to go back to like the birth of Islamism, which I'll distinguish between Islam, the faith practice between, with over 1 billion people, and Islamism. It's a political totalitarian outcome of the 20th century. While simultaneously acknowledging that Islamism is an outcome of Islam. It is not a total divergence, as some people would like to think. It's totally connected, but it can be separated in some ways. So what I'd say is when you look at Islam itself, and this is where the connection comes in, Islam, religion, like Judaism, Christianity, believe in a God, that God is a God of justice and God has a plan for history. It's predetermined. It's a predetermined plan. And each religion, Christians, Jews, and Muslims, believe that they have a role to play within that trajectory. And they attach their legitimacy to that trajectory in different ways. Now, the ways Muslims have attached their legitimacy is through temporal success, which power. Okay, there's no escaping the fact that Muslims believe that being in line with God's trajectory is power. So when you are expanding in this empire we spoke about earlier across a millennia, from halfway to Afghanistan to France to North Africa, even to Spain at some point, when you're expanding and you're powerful and you're winning all the wars and you're the forebearers of scientific advancement in the 16th century, then you're powerful, which means you're naturally in line with God's trajectory. But what happens when the Ottoman Empire, which was the last caliphate, what happens when that collapses? When the empire then collapses, it's not just a question of what happened to our empire, what happened to the Ottoman Turks, what happened to our civilization. It's accompanied by a very deep question of how did we lose God's divine favor? How have we veered from this divine trajectory and our meaning? Because now we are weak. Now we have lost all the power that has once given us legitimacy in God's historical trajectory. And that question about how did we lose God's favor and how do we regain his grace is the birthing moment of the Islamic renewalist period, which seeks to, in essence, re-establish a caliphate, an Islamic empire, on the one hand. And on the other hand, wants all the societies in which it governs to live according to Sharia law. Okay? So that births Islamic renewalism. Out of that comes organizations like the Muslim Brotherhood in 1928, which Hamas is a chapter of, that was founded in 87, 88 in Gaza. And that really is the birthing moment of Islamism. Islamism sees the West as its total enemy in preventing that caliphate from recoming about. This has a long history. People forget this. When Osama bin Laden planned 9/11 and he organized two planes to go into the Twin Towers, 9/11 was not just a date picked. There was a symbolic point to that date. 9/11 in the 1600s was the day that the Muslim empires arrived at the gates of Vienna. And it was the first time that the West stopped the Muslim armies in their conquest. It ended on 9/12, but the armies arrived on 9/11. And the message that Osama bin Laden sent to the West with the Twin Towers was that the war of the holy war of jihad, this which we're now I'd say we're in a fourth wave of jihad historically, is on. It was a very symbolic date that he chose. So there's a long history there. The West is seen as kind of a bulwark preventing the great Islamic empire from reestablishing itself.
Would you say that there's so many possible ways we can take this, but would you say that the Hamas-Israeli war is an extension of that, which happened in 9/11? It's just a continuation, is a part of everything? And also, would you say that the Israel-Hamas war is a religious war?
Yeah, I mean, I do think it's an extension of that. As I said, I think we're in a fourth wave of jihad. Historically, there's been three waves of jihad. Now, I understand that there will be maybe some people listening to this will say, well, jihad could also just mean an internal struggle with oneself. Yeah, that's fine. I mean, and find me anyone who's going to have a problem with that, right? It's fine. You want to have an internal struggle with yourself, that's okay. But most of the Muslim scholars dating back already 1,000 years have all agreed that the doctrine of jihad is the concept of a holy war against the holy war against an infidel enemy. So that's their doctrine and their concept, which is central. What I see is New York, I see Paris, I see London, I see Berlin, I see Israel, I even see New Orleans. All these attacks over the last 2 decades have all been slightly different. They've left each society under a pall of fear because of the terror. Some have been more organized, some have been lone wolf attacks, but all of them have been from the same ideology. And the greatest issue that is happening, that I see happening in the West, is that people refuse to name that ideology. Meaning, even the Americans, they called their entire war, they had a war for 20 years in the Middle East or whatever, or they at least had a presence there in Afghanistan for 20 years. They called it the war on terror. But terror is a tactic. It's not an ideology. So you're not even fighting anyone. You don't even know who you are. I mean, imagine just turning around and saying, yeah, we're not fighting, Nazism. Imagine Churchill just ignoring the fact of Nazism, right? What did that was Neville Chamberlain. He ignored Nazism, and that was disastrous. Churchill understood it, and he reigned victorious. In fact, I would say, and then, look, then the other thing, which was even worse to me, is that when the kind of idea of the war on terror didn't work, then jihadist violence espoused by the Islamists kind of just became known as this like a euphemism of violent extremism and lumped together with a whole bunch of homegrown kind of, like fascist, more far right kind of stuff. I'm not at all excusing that stuff on the far right, of course, but I'm saying it is distinct and it is different. And I'd say that the Americans, in my assessment, lost their wars. They certainly didn't win their wars in the Middle East. They lost their wars in the Middle East, and they lost their wars because they just totally refused to actually name the enemy that they were dealing with, to try and understand the enemy that they're dealing with. And you see this already now in Europe as well, with just totally not understanding what Israel's actually been fighting against.
But why are we so unwilling to call it out and name it for what it is? Why are we so unwilling to go into criticizing Islam? Is it because we're so afraid of getting branded as you're such a racist? Is that a big thing, or is it Islamophobia in itself? Which, as a side note, I've understood that that's also a part of the PR campaign from Hamas, and to brand everything as no, that's just Islamophobia. That's a whole funded type of PR campaign. Yeah. What do you think are the different mechanisms here that makes us in the West too scared to call it for what it is?
Yeah. Well, I think no one in the world would want to see war with the with the second largest faith in the world. No one wants to declare war on that. And that's the point. I'm not saying that that's what needs to happen. There's a total distinguishment between Islam as a faith practiced by over 1 billion people and Islamism, its 20th century totalitarian political outcome. Again, they cannot be disconnected from each other. One is an outgrowth of the other one, but they're not exactly the same. So what I'm saying is that that I think has prevented people from going there. They do not want to declare war. They think that if they declare war on Islamism, they're declaring war on Islam itself. So they've avoided that. No one, including myself, I do not want to see war on the second greatest religion in the world. Also, Islam is a very deep religion with many, very different components and a lot of beautiful components. There's a lot of things about Islam, even though I'm both Jewish and agnostic, there is a lot of things in Islam which I find to be quite deep and quite beautiful and quite meaningful. I don't negate those elements. But if your Islam is a rebellion against the West and a jihad against the Jews and some sort of conquesting component, then it has, in my opinion, none of the deep elements that are worthy of actually, in my opinion, of actually existing in the 21st century as ideas.
You can use and exploit religion in any way, right? For good or for bad.
Sure.
It goes for every religion.
So to the point of the second part of your question, here's what I'd say. Scott Atran is a famous anthropologist who said that in his lecture, he said that jihadi terrorism can be traced back to toxic male bonding in soccer clubs. I mentioned this to you last night, back to soccer clubs and barbershops in the Arab Muslim world. It's possibly the most delusional thing I've ever heard in my life. Honestly, that I've ever heard in my life. And someone, thank God, in the audience of this online lecture challenged him and said, are you saying that no jihadi suicide bomber has actually strapped a bomb to his chest to walk into a crowded room, blow himself up with totally void of the concept of getting into paradise? And he said, yes, no one believes in paradise. And to me, that's more irrational and delusional than anyone who believes in any form of paradise. To believe that no one believes in paradise is totally irrational. Like people who believing in paradise just for millennia and still do. Large portions of the world believe in paradise. The mere idea that this great anthropologist thinks that no one believes in paradise shows me the state of how blind some of the great minds in the West are to anything outside of their bubble that they live in. So they imagine that because they don't believe in God, or they can never be driven in their personal life by that such, religious ecstasy, that no one else could be. Except that's just not true, and it hasn't been true historically either, right? I think that's the great benefit of, in a way, of living in the Middle East, the ruthless facts of life in the Middle East. If you haven't tasted religious ecstasy personally, which I haven't because I'm not a particularly religious person, but you certainly can witness it up close. Now, my problem with the people that are doing what you're doing is that they are indeed the ones lacking the real empathy here, okay? And the reason why I say that is, yes, they... you could find a chorus of people that would call, maybe half the things I've said here today Islamophobic. That's fine. I reject that totally, and I'll tell you why. Because it's them who's failing to distinguish between Islamists and Islam. When you look at consider Afghanistan, okay? You can't claim to be a person who believes in human rights and freedom and dignity and liberty for all, and then be afraid to call out an ideology that is plummeting women as we speak, right now, as we sit here, on the other side of the world, in the region in which I live, into another dark age. Women are not even allowed to talk in public anymore. Okay? They can't even show even the eyes anymore.
They're not allowed to be seen from the
They're not
window,
allowed to
I
be
heard.
seen. They are sending people into another dark age, and yet they're still invited into the United Nations councils.
Let's go into that for a little bit.
Finish the one last part on that.
Yeah.
And then the other thing is that, there's a French institute, Fondapol, who are the most comprehensive keepers of Islamic terrorist attacks over the last few decades. And in that period, 20, 30 years, there's been 50,000 proper scale Islamic terror attacks. We're not talking about tiny little lone wolf stabbings in Jerusalem. You got hundreds of thousands, but we're talking about actual terror attacks. 90% of those have occurred in Muslim countries against local Muslim populations. So you are the person calling me an Islamophobe for saying this is actually the one who's totally defending the people persecuting these crimes. I am quite capable of distinguishing between Islam as a faith and Muslims as a people, and Islamism as an ideology, even if it is an outcome of Islam itself, and recognize that who are the true victims of Islamism? It's Muslim women, it's Muslim free thinkers, it's Muslim homosexuals, and it's Muslims who have become atheists. They are treated as total criminals in their own societies by theocracies and regimes and jihadi organizations and the Muslim Brotherhood ideology. They're treated as total criminals, devoid, stripped of rights and freedom, and totally ignored by the people who keep saying, I defend rights and freedom, and you're the racist for saying that. It's a total reversal of cause and effect. And it takes a huge amount of confusion to get to the point where you're prepared to avoid being labeled something. You're prepared to watch entire societies be plunged, like women be plunged in Iran into just, or Afghanistan into the dark ages, because you don't want to, from the comfort of your own home, be labeled an Islamophobe by fascists, by Islamists, right? I'm not interested what an Islamist thinks of me. This is not part of the consideration for me, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it's so egocentric and so narcissistic to like be willing to throw Muslim women under the bus
Totally.
like that at a grand scale, just because you're scared. Basically, you're scared of naming it for what it is. And I was curious when you're talking about women, because I've noticed this pattern of how these medieval kinds of extreme Islamists are so, in particular, obsessed with controlling women. Why do you think that is, that women is so important to control? Like, women cannot be seen, women cannot speak. Like, why? What is this obsession with controlling women in particular?
Yeah. Oh, that's a really deep question. It might be better suited for someone who's
if you were to speculate, like.
Look, I think you see it in all religions, right? You see it in extreme sects of Judaism, and you certainly see it in elements of Christian fundamentalism as well. There does tend to be within religion this kind of patriarchal hierarchy structure, and I think just as you tend to get more extreme and more extreme,
is it about controlling female sexuality?
It's about it. I definitely think there is something to do with that. I think there's a perverted nature to this, which is almost horrific. This is almost a road. This is one road that I feel totally uncomfortable walking down, because it is such a horrific thing to think about. But it is something that needs to be confronted, because here you can walk on the street. I don't know about Norway, but you can certainly walk on the street in other countries and see a hijabi woman leading a women's rights movement alongside like some like Western leftist wearing a vagina hat, and both are somehow considered symbols of female empowerment, when in reality, if you look at the countries that you're speaking about, the hijab is the symbol of gender apartheid in a majority of the Muslim world. There's a lot of confusion, but to the point that you're making, I mean, I don't know. What do you think it is? Do you have any theories on it? I think it has to do with perhaps honor culture, but because you see how dire and extreme the consequences are if a woman in these extreme Sharia countries are having a sexual affair or being raped, even. They're punished by death or by even more rapings. Like, they have an extreme obsession with female sexuality and controlling their females, right? Yeah.
So it feels like it's a part of honor culture, because the whole family will lose face and they will lose their facade if a female in their family is promiscuous or has sexual encounters of any kind, right? So I think that has a lot to do with that, keeping that kind of honor.
I think that's spot on. Yeah, for sure.
But also, let's define just for a moment, just to clear it up. What's the differences between like a Muslim, an Islamist, a jihadist? Is there even more expressions? Just to have a quick like summary of what are these different expressions about?
Yeah, well, you could say a Muslim is someone who subscribes to the doctrine of the Prophet Muhammad and believes in Allah and the Islamic faith. And there's many different sects of belief and many different types of, there's a Sunni and Shias and many different Wahhabis and different sects, just like in Christianity and just like in Judaism. A Muslim, someone who believes in the faith of Islam, in the word of the Prophet Muhammad. An Islamist is someone who subscribes to a particular political worldview that is birthed from Islam, which believes that societies should be governed by Sharia law, and that believes in reestablishing the Islamic Caliphate. Again, this is not disconnected from Islam, but it is not all-encompassing of the faith. It draws from components, and it's very much a totalitarian political movement born in the 20th century. And what was the third one?
The jihadists.
Oh, jihadists. Jihadists, I think the best way to understand the jihadis in today's times, they're usually those willing to die for the Islamist cause. Islamism is probably the best way to explain Islamism was, if we're referring to Islamism, it's probably more the political dimensions of the problem. The jihadists are the ones who are actually willing to go out and martyr themselves on behalf of the cause. They're willing to kill for the political dimension.
So would you say like the Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas and Hezbollah, would you label them as jihadists mostly?
Yeah, I mean the Muslim Brotherhood, I'd say they're Islamists because they have many different factions. I mean they have, they're even in schools and mosques and everything like that. So I wouldn't necessarily say that they're. I think jihadists is an element that comes out of the Islamist movement. Hamas is a jihadist movement. ISIS, Al Qaeda, but I think the best way to describe these movements are they're Islamist movements who seek to reestablish some sort of caliphate, some sort of Muslim governing body. It's called Dar al-Islam, right? Here's what's I think important to understand: the Muslims the Islamists divide the world into two categories: Dar al-Islam, okay, and Dar al-Harb, the house of Islam, Dar al-Islam, Dar al-Harb, the house of war. Dar al-Islam, the house of Islam, refers to lands, territories that are governed by Sharia and that were either Muslim territory or conquered by Muslim by Muslim armies. On the other side, Dar al-Harb, the house of war, is territories not governed by Sharia and territories not conquered by Islam. The ultimate goal of the Islamists is to spread Dar al-Islam, the house of Islam, across the world over Dar al-Harb through any means necessary, basically.
Does this go for both Sunni and Shia? And
this pretty much goes for both Sunni and Shia. Of course, in Sunni and Shia, there's different ways of looking at this. The Shia Iranians, the Iranian regime, they're largely driven a lot by the concept of the Mahdi, which is the Muslim. It's believed by both the Sunnis and Shias. But what makes the Iranians unique in this, and by when I say Iranians, I don't mean the people, I mean the regime, the Islamic regime in Tehran. What makes them unique about this when it comes to the Mahdi is that they don't just believe in this kind of apocalyptic figure or some sort of messianic drama unfolding. They believe the IRGC, and they write this it's in their mandate, in their own words, that their mission as a holy army, their mission is jihad in Allah's way as a military to pave the way for the coming of the Mahdi, which is the 12th Imam, which is apparently an Imam that is a descendant of Muhammad, a direct descendant of Muhammad, that's been in hiding for 1,000 years and is just waiting to be ushered back in to come and, bring about the end times. And it's really a total apocalyptic vision. And the danger of this, the danger of a vision like this, in the hands of a group like the IRGC, who are trying to get nuclear weapons, is that it seemingly totally inoculates people from seeing a nuclear war as a problem. This is what the Americans just don't get about the regime in Iran when it comes to the nuclear weapons. According to the doctrine, according to most Messianic doctrines, things really do kind of have to go hell in a handbasket for the best thing that's ever going to happen to finally happen. Things have to just go totally awry until this figure comes and hurls a bunch of infidels into a lake of fire, and then, the kind of civilization will be just a total utopia after that. So that totally inoculates people to seeing, a nuclear cataclysm as even a threat, because that's the kind of stuff that needs to happen to bring on the Mahdi. You're dealing, I think that in the West there's a tendency to totally downplay this. The last time we saw such a catastrophic downplaying of this was really with the Nazis in the Second World War, right? If I remember reading, it's always easy to judge in hindsight, but I remember reading some early interpreters of Nazism before Second World War, just after Hitler's election. There were a lot of people in Britain and France, particularly, who were writing about from 1934 to 1937. There were a lot of kind of political analysts and philosophers trying to kind of work out what this thing was. Most of them made the mistake of seeing Hitler as Mussolini and seeing Nazi Germany as just another fascist country. And therefore, because that's what they understood, they thought, all right, well, we can kind of keep this thing at bay. And that's where Chamberlain comes along and he says, all right, well, the policy of appeasement. The Germans believe that Sudetenland is part of their territory. Give them Sudetenland. But really, the Nazi phenomenon was not like, Hitler was not Mussolini, and the Nazi phenomenon was not just simply fascist. It was imperial and expansionist, and it required the submission of other countries and societies in order for the Reich, the Third Reich, to actually be established. And this is the component of Islamism, of this great spread of their idea of an Islamic state, essentially, that most Western countries ignore. They see it as kind of these separated segments and whatever, and they are largely separated, but they have the same goal. That's what's missing, I think, a lot of the time. It's not just violent extremism in some sort of country. They actually have a very deep goal rooted in deep history to re-establish this kind of empire in order to regain their own power, to be back in line with that trajectory that we spoke about.
It's almost as if people in the West just don't want to see this. It's like we have a tendency to see what we want to see, and we understand other people from the way we understand ourselves, perhaps, and that we lack this kind of moral fantasy to be able to understand that not all people are like us. Some people have extreme tendencies, extreme ideologies, and think in terms of not just in your own lifetime, but are willing to die for something, for a kind of imperial landscape to manifest. Like it's so outside of our own little Western safe little bubble that it's so difficult to grasp almost, which perhaps leads you to intellectualize and rationalize away. That this is probably what they want. You just project yourself onto them and giving them like nicer motives than they actually have.
Yeah, completely. I mean, that's definitely a huge problem. What I always say to people is there's just pretty much no evidence over the last 3 decades to suggest that when jihadists shout, we love death more than the infidels love life, there's just no evidence to suggest that they don't mean that.
Yes.
They act it out. They say it and they act it out. I think the best thing that the best lesson I think that everyone should always just live their life by is listen to people and take them at their word, right? These people just don't hide why they do what they do. I mean, all you need to do is recall a phone call made by a Hamas jihadist on October 7th after murdering, just a husband and wife, and then using that woman's phone to phone his family in Gaza to say that he had just murdered 10 Jews with his own bare hands. And immediately after his father and mother say, well, we're so proud of you, my son, he makes a reference directly to the Quran. Their blood is on their hands, which is a direct reference to the Quran. And he says that I have been brought here on Allah's way. And then continues to refer about the 10 Jews that he just killed and tells his family to open WhatsApp. He sent them a whole bunch of photos of these people that he's just murdered with his own hands. This is insane. This is insane. Okay? And I think it's so insane that some people will be like, this is person look, there's this tendency to believe among the West that the only thing that could drive people to do something like that is that they must have been so traumatized, okay, and so brutalized by someone else, okay, that they must have just been subjected to unendurable misery that must have just driven them totally insane that they could go and commit crimes like that and say things like that.
And in the end, it's the Western country's fault because it's our Western values who drove them to do that. Yeah, so it's our fault. So we should
exactly, but it's just total. It's just total nonsense. I mean,
and it's also victimizing. Like you're taking away their ability to have free will and to the ability
strip them of agency.
Yeah, of agency, right? And that's what I see to either victimizing or explaining it away as some kind of medical illness, some kind of psychiatric disease. Is like either that's the only two ways that the Western society can explain these things, because we don't have that kind of religious undercurrent, that kind of deep dimension to be able to grasp those ways of acting in the world.
Yeah, which is why when you speak to a Christian fundamentalist, let's say an evangelical living in the Bible Belt of America, or an ultra-Orthodox Jew living in, certain parts of Jerusalem, they really don't have a problem understanding why jihadists do what they do, because they understand the power of religious conviction. Whenever I speak to my, as a secular, when I speak to my more secular friends outside of Israel, especially, they just seek possibly every off-ramp they can, no matter how dangerously delusional they sound in that moment, they'll still seek it.
Why do you think they do that? Why is
it's
that?
Just a totally uncomfortable thing for them to realize that people can be totally driven to saying, I'm prepared to die for this in the name of religion.
Because and that would reveal something about themselves if you accept that.
Well, yeah, but I think that it goes against everything that the secular worldview believes in, which is just materialism. That if you give enough, here's the kind of, exactly. Here's the liberal tendency. And this is the criticism I have of liberalism. The concept is that all people are driven by the same fundamental needs.
That we're all the same.
That we're all the same. And those needs are freedom, dignity, security, the right to acquire property, and that if those needs are all met, then ultimately people will be seekers of goodness, pursuers of peace,
and be a good person.
Good people, patrons of Starbucks, and but the thing is that people are driven by far more than that. They're driven by meaning, transcendence, the desire to be a member of a collective, and they'll usually find that in religion or tradition, even the national myth, and that differs from place to place and from culture to culture. And even within those cultures, it differs from moderation to extremism. And when you ignore that latter part, then you can lead yourself to totally understandably thinking that the only reason that people commit this is not because they believe that if they blow themselves up that they're going to go to paradise, but because someone else must have just subjected them to the worst possible misery. And if you just hand them all the things that you say is the only thing that people desire in their lives, if you just give them a little bit more freedom, if you just give Hamas more freedom, if you just give the jihadists more dignity, if you just give them the right to acquire property, all these things, that will temper them down. That's a liberal delusion, because it has absolutely nothing to do with what drives their actions.
It's almost as if, they lack one of those 5 things that are needed to become a good person. And if they didn't get that, then the system has failed them. We have failed them as a Western society. It's our fault that they become terrorists, right?
Yeah.
Self-deprecating like that.
It's also just so, it's just so wrong as well, in the sense of Islamism itself, as much as I'm speaking against it, is really part of a very deep intellectual, ideological, and theological debate happening in the Muslim world. It's very deep, and it's far more consequential, certainly far more consequential than just about any Western debate happening in Harvard University right now. I can assure you that. It's definitely got more consequences for the world. It's very deep, and it sounds insane to say that it is this deep intellectual debate, Islamism, but it is. And when you look even at the jihadists, they have a moral framework. Now, that moral framework might seem totally insane to us, but it is a moral framework, okay? There is nothing more ordained of the highest order of morality than sacrificing one's life for God. So when they go and commit these acts, they are not, it's a total moral inversion of what we understand to be morality. Now, imagine being secular and coming to terms, and you're saying, hold on a second. Those people who just walked into a crowded room and blew themselves up, they think that's moral? that's the highest form of morality in their minds, that's a scary thing to confront. I don't negate that. That's a scary thing to confront. Just in Israel, we don't possess the privilege of being able to delude ourselves.
Yes.
We have to face the facts of that. We have to face that. And of course, there are many people in the West, people, Sam Harris, Douglas Murray, all those kind of people who have been speaking about this for years. It's not that thing yourself. There's many, many people who are dealing with.
But people don't want to listen to it.
Who are dealing with this. Yeah. And I got a feeling that there's maybe a bit more openness of late to it. I feel that myself when I speak about it, that there's certainly a little bit more openness to it.
Because we don't like being blown up.
Yeah.
It's a pragmatism almost to it.
Yeah. And also, the thing is if you do believe that it's your fault, it also means you got control over it.
Yeah.
Which is comforting. Because if these people are acting out of just some sort of political, social, economic grievance, well then you might have the means to change that circumstance for them. And if you can change that circumstance for them, not only can you mitigate the violence, but you're actually in control of what is a threat to you. But the minute you turn around and say, listen, you could funnel trillions and trillions of dollars into a jihadist organization, and they are absolutely going to use it to destroy you, not to better their own lives, which has been proven over and over again, it means you have absolutely no control and means you actually have to fight the enemy. And that's what people are trying to essentially avoid. And that kind of goes to many of the questions that you've asked throughout this. Why do people keep avoiding it? I think that possibly is the main reason.
And I think that also at a certain point, it's going to be like, it doesn't really matter why the jihadists do what they do. It doesn't matter. We don't have to get into their heads anymore. It's like pragmatism will take over. We just don't like being blown up. Like, I don't care why you do what you do. You're not going to do it to me anymore.
Yeah.
I don't care about your thinking. Like, have your thinking your way. You're not going to blow me up. Blow yourself up.
It's I agree with you, but and I certainly would relate to that myself. I think the problem is, I think that they were kind of a little bit of what the Americans did with the war on terror.
Yeah.
We're not really interested in why you're doing what you're doing. But we need to beat you in this war, and then we need to implement some sort of political program afterwards to solve this. They just didn't understand who they were dealing with, and because of that, they, it's very important. I mean, it's the difference between Churchill and Chamberlain.
Yeah,
really, in the Second World War, Churchill really understood Hitler. He was very smart. He understood Nazism. And the British Parliament ignored him for years on it. He was the only person. He sounded like a lunatic at first talking about this. He genuinely, I read some of the things he said in Parliament and some of the reactions to what he was saying, and they thought he was a total lunatic when he was speaking about, Hitler and the rise of Nazism and the dangers. And Chamberlain seemed like the pragmatic, I bring the peace for our time and all this kind of stuff. But Chamberlain was the delusional one about what he was dealing with. I really think that we underestimate the power of acknowledging and understanding the enemy, your enemy. Yes. I think it's a very powerful thing, and I think it's essential for any victory in a war.
What's interesting too, I think, is that Nazism in Germany, it's so perplexing to think about that it could arise in such a cultural country with so much education and so much intellectuals coming from that country, with the beautiful music of Bach and Beethoven and all these highly intelligent people and highly educated society, and yet they were the ones who decided to annihilate and murder 6 million Jews and do this. How do you conflate? How do you square these two things together, that such a educated and cultural country could come up with that and be responsible for that?
Yeah, I actually started my career out studying the rise of the Nazi phenomenon and what prepared Europe, the European streets, for those most terrible crimes. And in a way, I kind of think it does loop in. Well, firstly, I think misunderstanding it loops into what we spoke about earlier with the delusions of not naming your enemy. What prepared Germans for that? I mean, There's a French philosopher, René Girard, who speaks about, he has a book called The Scapegoat. It's quite a famous book. He speaks about the Jews being the ultimate scapegoat. That societies are essentially developed with different groups within a society, and there's tensions between these groups. And as the tensions reach a boiling point and violence threatens the fabric of the community, of the collective society, all the collective animosity and tension is seemingly just laser sharp focused onto the scapegoat. Yes, Germany was the producer of all these things, but Germany was also a country in total crisis because it miscalculated its power in World War I, and it came out really on the wrong end of that. And Hitler was very clever in the way in which he could play on the German resentment towards the Versailles Treaty, towards the Franco-Prussian War, all these different things, a collapsed economy, again using the Jews as a scapegoat for the people, the reason behind the economy being collapsed. These are the people, the reason for your suffering. There's almost nothing more powerful. Okay, this is why I say anti-Semitism is the most successful political ideology of the 20th and 21st century. That's maybe a good way to understand it as a political ideology, because there's almost nothing more powerful as a politician than to say you're suffering and they're why. Because that's very simple. That doesn't require much. You'll be surprised. People say, well, how could people, just believe that? Pretty easily. It goes firstly of what we spoke about in the beginning, about 2 millennia of kind of Christian world anti-Semitism leading up to that, with all these tropes instilled in people, kind of underlying the fabric of Western civilization, firstly. And secondly, if you have a really angry population that's deeply resentful, and you give them finally an answer, and you say, they're responsible, deal with them and everything's going to get better for you, you'll be surprised at the levels that people that people can go to, right? So, societies that are successful are totally capable of doing the most barbaric things as well. I don't think that necessarily contradicts each other. I think Bach can come out of Germany, and so Hitler can come out of Austria, but he can become the Führer of Germany and ride in, on the support of the German people.
Yeah, because I find that there's no correlation between education level and intelligence and moral valor.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Because that's such a trope when you hear people in debates and intellectuals like in Norway and the Western world say that, what we need to combat and remedy against terrorism is more education, right? As if education is and more knowledge is the only remedy.
The heal.
But then you forget that some of the greatest terrorists were highly educated people, right?
Completely.
Yeah, professors, and they had lots of knowledge. So it's not knowledge that is lacking; it's another dimension.
Yeah, this is actually the problem. Is that, and that's why I really try to make that point where I said that Islamism is part of a very deep intellectual and ideological and theological debate that's happening within the Muslim world. If you just look at these people, of course, you look at them and you see them just committing the most egregious crimes, and you view them as criminals void of any sort of worldview. Then you're going to view, okay, we just need to do better education, right? I'm not saying that education is not worthy and not necessary. It has to be there, but it's a component of it. It's not the full picture. But there's nothing about Islamism that isn't rooted in a moral framework. There's nothing about Islamism that doesn't have an ideological structure as deep as fascism, as deep as communism, as deep as Marxism, as deep as socialism. It's really deep worldview there. Al-Banna, the founder, okay, he wasn't much of an intellectual. He was kind of founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, which, as we said, Hamas is a chapter of. But Sayyid Qutb, I mean, he's just a tremendous thinker. I mean, the most deranged person I think I've ever read in my life. Certainly a rabid anti-Semite. Wrote the book, his most famous book, or at least the most famous book among his Muslim followers, is called Our Struggle with the Jews. which is in no short reference to someone else who wrote a book called My Struggle, which was also about the Jews. Certainly not unintelligent people. I mean, you just look at the crisis in England, right? I mean, people just want to avoid this, and I totally understand why. Because you by no means want to indict anyone innocent here in this, but the truth of the matter statistically is that more British Muslims joined ISIS than the British Army.
Oh,
okay, that's a pretty shocking statistic.
Wow.
And there's a lot of them who went and joined ISIS were not poverty-stricken, were not stripped of their rights and freedoms, and were not, some beaten down like class of people. They were living in one of the freest societies in the world. And in fact, a whole handful of them were doctors and lawyers. I mean, that just puts that entire framework that we spoke about earlier just totally to bed. You cannot make the argument that a middle-aged, really successful doctor living in London, okay, somehow was just stripped of all their property and freedom and dignity and security. So because of that, they went and joined ISIS. No, there was clearly something else drawing the moth to the flame, right? And it clearly had nothing to do with any of those.
That's what's so scary, right? Because people that you think are educated and have normal jobs and are enjoying the freedoms of Western society are then suddenly almost like activated sleeper cells, right?
Yeah.
Going and joining ISIS. Like how are we going to reconcile these two different kinds of ways of living almost? That how can we, what's like your optimistic view going forward? How can we avoid this happening? How can we have, I don't know, even know what words to use. Like people talk about integration, how integration has failed. But I don't think it's about integration. It's about two completely diametrically opposed ideologies and ways of living and seeing the world. How can these coincide and live together? Like, what's your take on that?
Since October 7th, I've actually surprisingly found quite a bit of hope in certain ways. I've just met, through the work I've done, some of the most amazing individuals working in precisely that question of what you're speaking about. And they all happen to be Muslim, and they all happen to be or ex-Muslims and now atheists. These are really, in my opinion, really the heroes of or will be, hopefully, the heroes of the story. And they really do deserve all of our support. Because, as I've said, I'm a big supporter of the Enlightenment principles that really Western societies, fundamentally today, liberal democracies are built on. Those are the people that deserve our full support. Just take a lot of, find the courage again to just take immense pride. I mean, this is coming from a Jew whose family escaped Europe. Just take immense pride in what came out of all the atrocities that your societies did indeed commit. But what came out of it is just the best thing that we've got. Stop shoving that down as some just disgusting thing. Take some sort of pride in that. It's fine to be totally patriotic about the great things of one's culture. I understand integration, some sort of integration, that there's got to be better programs for that. I think the reason it's failed is just because I think the politicians have largely totally failed in that. So that's got to be a thing. But there's just totally amazing people that are out there. Ayaan Hirsi Ali, Yasmin Mohammed. These are just two names that are popping into my head right now. It's just totally amazing human beings.
The Green Prince.
Yeah. These are just totally amazing human beings. Just saying it like it is and doing the most incredible work. And yeah, some of them are atheists and some of them converted to Christianity and some of them are still Muslim and they're reformists. But they really deserve our support.
On a personal note, we were talking about yesterday that your grandparents were actually escaping from Vienna. To, was it London?
Yeah, well, my great grandparents they went to London.
Yeah, that's interesting because it's the same story I have. My great grandparents and grandparents escaped from Vienna because they saw the writing on the wall. They saw what was happening in 1938. and they actually lived in Vienna then and saw that Hitler was rising to power, and they looked around and tried to find where could we go, and they looked to Norway, and they came here, and your family went elsewhere, and
to London.
but it's interesting to sit now like diasporic Jews and contemplating Europe and Western society and where we are right now. I wonder if our great grandparents, what they would have thought us sitting here like this talking about it.
And I often have that thought. Living in Israel kind of also allows that, because you think back to the early Zionists and their concept of kind of the return of the exiles, and I could just find myself walking around Israel just totally randomly, or meeting someone totally randomly. Their grandparents, great grandparents could be from Yemen or Morocco, or they could be from Switzerland or something like that. And I'm just fine. Your grandparents or great grandparents, my great grandparents, at some point all kind of wished that this would be a thing. Now it's a thing. Now we're here. I wonder what they think about the fact that we're speaking. Yeah, it's just a fascinating thing. I mean, it shows just the power of the. I mean, I just think that the power of the Zionist movement is just totally it just surpasses so many things, because it's kind of really the spirit that we need to really cling to in these dark times for Jewish people. It was rooted not in victimhood. It was rooted really in a constructive vision, and it was not apologetic, and it was not ashamed of itself, but it was totally constructive and totally forward thinking, and totally willing to both defend, attack where necessary, but also at the same time recognize opportunities for alliance. I really think that's pretty much where we gotta keep. We gotta keep it. Zionism has pretty much been the only successful answer for the Jews in a really, really long time.
Yeah,
and we gotta. I think we really gotta hold on to that, and gotta weather the storm that's going on right now, and people that are trying to delegitimize the Zionism in all accounts. We really got to hold on to that. It provides us actually, I think we're actually, not just because of the state of Israel itself, but just the Zionist principles and the Zionist framework, actually provides the Jews with just probably the most phenomenal blueprint of having both the intellectual and social frameworks from which to weather the storm, which just did not exist in the 1700s and the 1600s, and even weren't really able to exist and be used in times of the 30s and 40s. But they can now, not only because there's a state that actually exists, but we really are in the weirdest ways kind of the luckiest generation, despite the fact of what we're going through over the last year and a bit.
Because you're actually not a part of the diaspora anymore. You're home in Israel. Like you're a product also of the Zionist movement. You have enacted it and manifested it in your life. What is it like to feel? Do you feel at home as a Jew in Israel?
Yeah. I love living in Israel, particularly Tel Aviv. That's where I see my life. It was a very strange thing. I never really felt any sense of belonging in South Africa. Never. I mean, I remember being a kid of like 10 years old and being like, I'll move to America. Or I'll move to England at 13. I'll move to Spain at 15. And then I went to Israel for the first time, moved there. It was just the weirdest thing that it felt like when I got to Israel, I was just like immediately touchdown. I was like, this is where I'm meant to be. And this is for me. Not everyone has that experience, but I certainly have had that experience. And it's been a real, just a wholesale great decision for me. It's probably the best, like, I don't say this in any sort of like tongue-in-cheek way. It's probably the best decision I've ever made in my life, to move there.
Can you explain why, you think?
Yeah, I think that the work that I do, if I want to do that work in a meaningful capacity, I felt like I needed to be there on the ground. That's one component of it. Number two, there's just something about Tel Aviv which just really jives with my personality. I'm not exactly sure what it is, but Tel Aviv, it's just a very unique place. And it's just the energy that exists there is just really on the same kind of, as you'd say in Israel, tether, the same frequency as me. I'm not sure exactly what it is, but it's there. Beyond that, I really do feel a deep sense of belonging to that place and to the Jewish people in general. And I think that it's just so those three components would just made it totally, it just really set me up. When you feel that way about a place, or you feel that way about anything really, it kind of sets you up in a way to make a lot of decisions that could work out pretty well for you. And as long as there's some help along the way, as long as you come across some great people, as I've been lucky enough to come across, who are willing to help and to assist and to give you guidance, and it's just a great place. And that is one thing I will say about Israelis is there's many jokes about Israelis that they're rude. They're not rude. They just don't have time for small talk. But Israelis, I say the difference between Israelis and Americans, Israelis are not nice, but they're kind. And Americans are nice and not kind.
That's a good,
it's just a
good way to say
tongue-in-cheek, no offense to any Israelis or Americans that know it. It's that Israelis are very kind people.
Yeah.
And I felt reaching out to people, just random people when I got there, just who I respected, who work as researchers or intellectuals or writers. It was just so really damn kind to me and willing to kind of really assist. Just not something that I see in other countries. I mean, when I told some of my friends who work in institutes in other countries about that, they were like just totally shocked by that I could just get access to people that the kinds of people you could get access to, and they were just totally willing to help. That's a very powerful thing about that country. That's probably overlooked by the people, by Israelis born there.
Yeah.
But like that kind of communal idea is very powerful. I just feel like I'm meant to be there. I belong there, and because I belong there, it makes a lot of the difficulties of life far easier.
Yeah, because it's meaningful.
Yeah.
Well, Samuel, I thank you so much for talking with me, coming here to my studio, and for getting to know you.
Yeah,
it's been a real pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me. Appreciate it.
And thank you to all our listeners and everybody who has watched this show. Thank you so much. All right, man.